Hello, everyone. Enjoy these relaxing yet powerful stories of resilience and triumph. It was just another quiet Tuesday afternoon in the heart of Rockview, a town known for its pristine sidewalks, polished storefronts, and the unwavering pride its citizens held for its oldest bank, Capital First Bank. The air inside the lobby was filled with soft jazz, polite chatter, and the gentle clicking of polished heels on marble floors. The scent of expensive perfume mingled with that of fresh ink and new bills, a modern temple of finance and privilege. That's when the doors creaked open, heads turned, casual at first, expecting a late appointment or a delivery man. But what they saw froze the air in place. A hunched old man stepped inside. He was black, frail, his hair a wild nest of graying curls. His coat, oversized and fraying at the seams, was a patchwork of time and hardship. Dirt stained his sleeves, and the soles of his shoes flapped loosely as he shuffled forward. A canvas bag, sun-faded and worn thin, hung over his shoulder like a burden he had carried far too long. If you felt the weight of injustice, or moments where people judged you too soon, this story will hit deep. Make sure to hit the like button if it already speaks to you, and don't forget to subscribe to RVM. Amazing stories for more unforgettable, true-life dramas like this. The laughter began almost immediately, not loud but sharp, cutting. Some snorted, others whispered. A woman in a tan pantsuit clutched her handbag tighter, eyeing him as though he were disease walking. Behind the main counter, a young teller named Kevin nudged his colleague Michael and muttered, "Looks like someone wandered in from the shelter again." Michael smirked. Poor guy's probably looking for the soup kitchen. A middle-aged customer in pearls rolled her eyes and sighed. These people. The man didn't flinch. He didn't glance sideways or look ashamed. Instead, he walked with deliberate purpose, his feet slow but every step firm. His name was Franklin Miles, though no one in that room knew that yet. What about you? Did this opening scene grab your heart or stir your curiosity? Comment 1 if it did, 0 if it didn't, and if you're still unsure, just hit that subscribe button and stick around for what comes next. You won't regret it. The security guard, a broad-chested white man named Robert Bob Miller, spotted him and straightened up. Bob was a stickler for order, a believer in clean lines and clearer boundaries. He rested a hand on his belt, just close enough to his sidearm to make a point. Franklin stopped in the center of the marble floor. His voice, though quiet, rang out like a hammer dropped in a courtroom. "This bank is mine." The lobby erupted. Someone laughed outright. A man near the ATMs whispered, "This guy's off his med." Even Bob let out a scoff before stepping forward. But Franklin didn't budge. He didn't explain. He didn't argue. He just stood there, calm, unyielding, eyes locked on the vaulted ceilings like he'd built them himself. Every moment of this story builds towards something powerful. So, if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, please share this video with a friend and help us shine light on voices long ignored. People didn't know it yet, but something had just shifted. This wasn't the start of a disturbance. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The tension in the bank crackled like static electricity. As Franklin Miles stood rooted in the center of the marble floor, his simple declaration, "This bank is mine," hung in the air, disbelieved and discarded by nearly everyone within earshot. Bob Miller, the security guard, didn't wait for approval. He began walking toward Franklin with a slow, deliberate pace, his heavy boots echoing across the glossy floor like warning shots. Bob was a man who had spent his life believing he was the final line between order and chaos, and in his eyes, this man with a ragged coat and haunted eyes was the embodiment of the latter. "Sir," Bob said with practiced condescension, "you're going to need to leave. You can't just walk in here and make bizarre claims." Franklin didn't respond, his eyes dark, steady, fixed on something beyond the surface of Bob's irritation. Behind the counter, Nathan Prescott, the bank manager, finally looked up from his screen. Nathan was in his 40s, dressed in a crisp navy suit, with his blonde hair parted so precisely it looked like a measuring tape had been used. He was a man who lived by policies and handshakes, by country club brunches and ironed reputation. He stepped out from behind the glass barrier, adjusting his tie with deliberate calm. "What seems to be the issue here, Bob?" he asked, already annoyed by the scene. "This gentleman is claiming ownership of the bank," Bob replied, a smirk tugging at the edge of his mouth. Nathan looked Franklin up and down like he was an unsolved equation on a balance sheet. "Sir, I don't know what you think this is. but Capital First Bank has been owned by the Lancaster family for 3 generations. I'm afraid you're mistaken. Franklin finally turned to look Nathan in the eye. No, you're mistaken. Something was taken from me a long time ago. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to take back what's mine. The room filled with hushed gasps, phones subtly angled to record. Emily Carter, the youngest teller, peeked from behind her workstation, her usual quiet demeanor replaced with uneasy curiosity. Near the coffee bar, an older white man muttered, "This is what happens when you let them wander around His wife nodded silently, gripping her coat tighter. Behind the scenes, the whispers took shape, ugly, loaded ones. Words like crazy, homeless, delusional. Franklin heard them all. He'd heard them his whole life, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he lowered his bag gently onto the floor, the canvas so old it sighed beneath his touch. Nathan's voice sharpened. "If you don't leave right now, I'll have Bob escort you out." But Franklin only knelt beside the bag, and that's when something shifted. The laughter because as Franklin slowly reached for the worn strap, and his fingers touched the edge of whatever was inside, even Bob took one step back. Something in the room had changed, and no one, absolutely no one, was ready for what came next. Franklin's hand trembled slightly, not from fear but from years of wear, of carrying more than just this bag. As he slowly unbuckled the flap, the room held its collective breath. Even Bob Miller, who moments earlier had his hand resting confidently on his sidearm, now looked uneasy. His stance stiffened, his gaze narrowing as if trying to gauge the threat level of a man carrying a manifesto, a bomb, a trick. But when Franklin pulled out the contents of the bag, the room did not explode. It fell silent. In his gnarled hands, Franklin held a book, worn, faded, bound in leather the color of rust and old blood. The cover bore a faint embossed seal that only a few recognized. It was aged, yellowed with frayed edges, and ink that had begun to bleed with time. But even in its fragile state, it demanded reverence. He raised it like a relic. "This," he said, "is the original ledger of Capital First Bank, back when it was founded in night." Gasps rippled across the marble lobby. Nathan Prescott blinked, his practiced poise faltering as he took a cautious step forward. "What are you talking about?" "I built this bank," Franklin said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. There was something unshakable about the way he spoke, like stone laid into foundation. "My name is in this ledger, alongside my business partner, before greed and hatred took it from me." Nathan scoffed reflexively. "That's impossible. There's no record." Franklin turned the book toward him, flipping carefully to a page marked with a rusted paperclip. And there it was, the signatures, 2 names in looping, careful ink, Franklin Miles and John W. Hammond. The room tilted. Nathan stared at it, color draining from his face. Behind him, Kevin and Michael, the 2 tellers who had been sneering earlier, leaned in to look, the smirks now erased from their faces. "This bank was founded on stolen ground," Franklin continued, "built with my hands, my money and my dream, then buried under lies, just because I was black." The truth didn't scream, it whispered. And in that whisper was something heavier than any gun Bob Miller could carry. It was history. It was betrayal. Nathan reached forward, almost afraid to touch the book, as if it might brand him with guilt. "That can't be real," he said weakly. "You could have forged this." Franklin looked him in the eye. "You'll find the same handwriting in your own archive if you ever had the courage to look." Even Bob's hand now hovered uncertainly by his side, and from somewhere behind the counters, a voice whispered, barely audible, "What if he's telling the truth?" For the first time, the walls of Capital First Bank, the ones polished with power built on sanitized history, began to crack. And the man they had laughed at, he had just begun to speak. The weight of Franklin's words settled over the lobby like a thundercloud. Every person present, tellers, customers, managers, even Bob, felt it. The kind of weight that turns air to iron, that slows time, that makes people forget how to breathe. Nathan Prescott still held the ledger with trembling hands. He didn't speak, couldn't. His blue eyes darted from the signatures to Franklin, then back again. His lips parted as if to refute it, but nothing came. From behind the desk, Emily Carter, the youngest employee, leaned forward in stunned silence. She'd been invisible in the eyes of the bank's upper brass until today, quiet and obedient. But now, her eyes shimmered not with fear but with a quiet awakening. Bob Miller, however, had no such awakening. His grip on authority was forged from decades of training, of lines never crossed. He snapped out of the paralysis with a grunt and stepped forward once again. now with the same aggression that came naturally to him. "That's enough," Bob barked. "This is a bank, not a courtroom. You don't get to come in here and stir up chaos because of some old notebook you pulled out of your attic." Franklin didn't flinch. "This notebook is the only record of the truth. A truth your bank buried to protect men like the Lancasters and silence men like me." Bob's jaw tightened. "Sir, you are seconds from being removed. Don't make me." Nathan lifted a hand. "Bob, wait." The two men locked eyes. It was the first time Nathan had ever overruled the guards so directly. "Wait," Bob said through gritted teeth. "You're seriously entertaining after everything we've built?" "After everything we've built on what?" Nathan shot back, the edge in his voice unfamiliar even to him. Bob's eyes flared. "On order, on law, on keeping people like him out of places they don't belong." The moment the words left Bob's mouth, the lobby recoiled. Even the most skeptical customers, those who had been rolling their eyes earlier, shifted uncomfortably. The ugliness was naked now, too real to ignore. Franklin simply stood still. He had faced work. He turned to the crowd and spoke again. Not loud, but with a clarity that cut through marble and glass. "Look at how quickly the truth makes them panic." The room held its breath. Bob's hand slid toward his gun, not drawn but too close for comfort. The gesture screamed louder than any slur. Then Emily stepped out from behind her desk. Tiny, unnoticed Emily. She walked slowly, hands raised, not in fear but in defiance of the moment's violence. She moved past Bob without a word and bent down. Gently, she picked up one of the faded bills that had spilled from Franklin's bag, running her fingers across the long retired Chase logo. She looked at Franklin, her voice shaking but clear. "I believe you, Mr. Miles." And just like that, the storm began to shift direction. The reckoning had gained its first follower. For a moment, no one moved. The sound of Emily Carter's soft but steady voice, "I believe you, Mr. Miles," still echoed off the marble walls like a stone tossed into still water. No shouting, no more laughter, just a silence that suddenly felt heavier than any noise. Franklin, Miles looked at her, really looked. For decades he had spoken truth to deaf ears, but in this moment, in this place of power and polished lies, a single voice had broken through. He gave her a slight nod, a gesture of quiet thanks. Bob Miller, meanwhile, was seething. His hand hovered by his gun holster like it was glued there, his face twitching with fury and confusion. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Cart?" he snapped, his voice louder than it needed to be. "You just made yourself part of this mess." Emily didn't back down. She turned to face him with a steadiness even she didn't know she possessed. "Maybe it's time someone did." Behind her, a hush fell across the employees clustered at their workstations. One by one, heads turned. Even Kevin and Michael, who earlier had mocked Franklin without shame, now stood frozen in place, watching. Then unexpectedly, Kevin stepped out from behind the teller window. I'm sorry for how I spoke earlier," he muttered, not looking at Franklin at first. Then he raised his eyes. "I trust you too, Mr. Miles." He reached down, picked up one of the old bills from the floor, and placed it gently on the desk next to Emily. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. It was a quiet apology, but louder than any argument. Michael followed, sheepish and red-faced. Then another teller, then a loan officer. Each placed an old yellowed bill before Franklin like an offering, not for approval, but for acknowledgement, for truth. Franklin didn't gloat, didn't cry. He simply stood tall, eyes shining with something long forgotten, hope. Bob looked around, realizing his grip on the room was slipping fast. The crowd that once sneered and chuckled was now watching him, not Franklin, with suspicion. He growled, "This is insane. He's making fools of all of you." But Nathan Prescott remained silent, watching, calculating. Then Bob made the worst move of his life. With a flash of frustration, he unsnapped the strap of his holster. In a single swift motion, he drew his sidearm, not aiming it, but holding it clearly in the open, just enough to reassert power, just enough to send a message. The room gasped, someone screamed, others backed toward the exits. Franklin didn't move. He looked death in the eye as if it were an old friend. Nathan Prescott stepped forward fast, his voice sharp and panicked. "Bob, put the weapon down." But Bob wasn't listening anymore. His hand was trembling, his pride was crumbling, his world built on rules and dominance was falling apart. "You think you can walk in here, wave some old paper and tear down everything we've built?" he shouted at Franklin. "You don't belong here." Franklin finally spoke, voice steady, cold.
like steel through smoke. I've always belonged here. You just couldn't see it. Nathan took another step between them. The manager who had once scoffed at Franklin now stood as his shield. Bob, he said firmly, you're done. Bob Miller stood frozen, his gun lowered, but still gripped with white-knuckled tension. His face was flushed with humiliation, fury, and something even more dangerous. Fear. Not fear of Franklin, not even of Nathan, but fear of losing control, of being the one outnumbered, the one suddenly wrong. The entire lobby of Capital First Bank was holding its breath. Customers had backed away to the far walls, some quietly, filming with shaking hands. The employees, once indifferent, even cruel, now watched with wide, conflicted eyes. It was no longer just about an old man with a ledger. It was about all of them. Nathan Prescott, standing between Bob and Franklin, could feel his pulse pounding against his collar. The weight of responsibility had never pressed so hard. Put the gun down, Nathan said again, more forcefully this time. Bob hesitated. For a moment, you could almost see the war behind his eyes, the decades of loyalty, the black and white worldview he'd built around himself, now crumbling at the seams. He looked at Franklin, then at Emily, then back at the trembling bills on the marble floor. Finally, with a ragged breath, Bob returned the gun to its holster. The sound of the clip snapping shut was deafening in the silence. You're making a mistake, Nathan, Bob muttered, his voice low and bitter. You're siding with a fantasy over reality. No, Nathan replied, stepping back toward Franklin. I'm siding with the truth. Maybe for the first time in my life. Bob stood still, seething, but he didn't speak again. The power had shifted, and he knew it. Nathan turned to Franklin. He studied the old man's face for a long moment, the calm strength behind the weathered eyes, the dignity still standing after decades of injustice. Something broke in Nathan, a dam, a wall he didn't even know had existed inside him. I've seen enough, Nathan said to everyone in the room. We're not brushing this under the rug. We're taking this to the board. Gasps, whispers, disbelief. You'll lose everything, Bob hissed. Your job, your reputation, you'll be buried. Nathan didn't even look at him. If standing up for what's right costs me everything, then maybe everything I had wasn't worth keeping. He turned to the staff, to the customers, to the silent cameras pointed their way. From this day forward, this bank is going to stop pretending it was built on clean hands. Mr. Franklin, Miles deserves to be heard, and we are going to let the truth speak, no matter how long it's been buried. Emily wiped a tear from her cheek. Kevin and Michael stood taller. One of the customers clapped softly, then another, then another. It wasn't loud, but it was. Bob turned and walked away, alone. And Franklin, he didn't smile. He simply looked up at the high ceiling of the place he had once built, and the lobby of Capital First Bank slowly began to stir. But the usual buzz of business had been replaced by something deeper. No longer was Franklin Miles a source of mockery. He was a living contradiction to the story everyone thought they knew. The man they dismissed as a drifter now stood at the center of a reckoning. As Bob Miller disappeared down the corridor, his boots echoing like the last beats of a failed regime, Franklin turned slowly to Nathan Prescott. Nathan still gripped the old leather ledger tightly, as if it might disappear if he let go. His mind was spinning. The signature, the documentation, the bills, the dated seals. It was all there, all real, and he knew that the next steps would shake the foundation of everything the bank had stood on for decades. This can't stay within these walls, Nathan said quietly. Franklin nodded. It was never meant to. Nathan gestured toward the back. I want to take this to the board. Today, we'll start the process. Investigate. Verify everything. You'll have your hearing. Franklin's eyes gleamed, not with joy but with something more profound. Recognition. I didn't come here for revenge, he said. I came so the truth could breathe. Then he slowly bent down and reached into his bag once more. The room watched as he pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilskin, carefully protected as though it were a newborn child. He placed it gently on the center desk. These are the original deeds, Franklin said. Documents that prove I never signed over ownership to anyone, not to the Lancaster family, not to anyone. They were forged, hidden, buried. Nathan swallowed hard. The name Lancaster still carried weight in Rockview, enough to make politicians flinch and lawyers salivate. If this story went public, it wouldn't just be a scandal, it would be a reckoning for one of the wealthiest families in the state. From behind the desk, Emily spoke up. "We'll stand with you, Mr. Miles, no matter what comes." Josh, Kevin and Michael stepped forward again, quietly echoing the sentiment. "You have us," Kevin said. "We're not letting this go quiet." Franklin didn't respond at first. He looked around the lobby, his eyes scanning the same marble pillars he once dreamed into being, the same stained glass window that still bore the initials of the bank he'd built, not as Capital First, but as Miles Hammond Trust, long since erased from record. "When we built this bank," Franklin said softly, "we poured our lives into it. My partner, John Hammond, he was my friend, but when the money got bigger, so did his fear of standing beside a black man." The room went still again. "He sold me out to the Lancaster, helped rewrite the ownership papers, told the courts I had abandoned my role. They erased me, from the board, from the bank, from history." Nathan's hands tightened on the ledger. "You don't have to be erased anymore," he said. "No," Franklin replied, stepping back. "Now, I finally get to exist again." Nathan Prescott stood before the boardroom doors, with Franklin's ledger in one hand, and the wrapped legal documents in the other. Behind him, Emily Carter and a handful of staff followed in silent solidarity. The rest of the bank remained hushed, clients quietly exiting, co-workers whispering, the building itself holding its breath. News was already leaking. One customer had posted a grainy video of Franklin's confrontation with Bob Miller online. It was spread inside the executive boardroom. The temperature was cold, not physically, but in spirit. The long table of Lancaster family heirs, legal advisors, and financial directors stared down Nathan with the thinly veiled hostility of people who had everything to lose. At the head sat Darren Lancaster, the silver-haired patriarch, whose fortune had been carved from decades of silent takeovers, strategic erasures, and history rewritten to suit power. Nathan placed the documents and the ledger on the center of the table. "This bank," he began, his voice steady, "was co-founded in 1948 by a man named Franklin Miles. He was forced out, and his name was wiped from our history by means of fraud and racial injustice. There was no polite clearing of throats, no murmurs, just dead silence." Darren leaned forward slowly. "Where did you get this?" "From him," Nathan answered. "He came into the lobby today, not to threaten, not to protest, just to be heard." A long silence passed. Then, coldly, Darren responded, "And you believed him?" Nathan opened the ledger and turned it toward the board, revealing Franklin's name alongside John W. Hammond's. "I verified the handwriting with our own archives. His name appears in the original drafts. In these ledgers, the documentation never made it into our public record, but the seal, the founding seal of this bank, is there." It was his. One of the younger board members, a sharp-suited man named Carson, sneered. "Even if what you're saying is true, and I'm not saying it is, what do you expect us to do? Hand him the bank, rewrite 70 years of history?" "No," Nathan said, "but we can't keep living a lie. You dragged this institution through the mud because of some dusty old book," Darren growled. Nathan's spine straightened. "Because of justice." "Justice," Darren repeated like it was a dirty word. "You've been working for us for how long, Nathan? You really want to throw all that away for some man you don't even know?" "I know enough," Nathan said. "I've seen the documents. I've seen his eyes." He placed both hands on the table. "And I've seen what we've become by hiding from the truth." The room exploded into arguments, legal threats, shouted warnings, cries of fabrication of insanity. But Nathan stood silent as they barked, because he already knew, outside that room, justice had already begun, and inside it the empire built on silence had just been cracked wide open. The argument inside the boardroom escalated like a fire fueled by decades of buried guilt. Words like slander, reputation, and legacy were hurled across the table like weapons. But Nathan Prescott stood in the eye of the storm, calm, resolute, and utterly unmoved. Across from him, Darren Lancaster's face was flushed with rage. "You have no idea what kind of damage you're inviting. This man's story is unverifiable hearsay. This bank is a pillar of this community. You want to tear it all down over the accusations of an old man." Nathan didn't blink. "No, Darren, I'm trying to finally build it on truth." He gathered the documents and ledger and turned toward the door. but not before delivering one last blow. And if any of you decide to try to suppress this evidence, you'll be doing it in front of the press, a legal team and the people of Rockview, because I'm not backing down. As Nathan stepped out of the boardroom, his pulse racing, he was met by the stares of nearly every bank employee lined up in the hallway. Emily Carter stood at the front, a silent pillar of courage. Kevin, Michael and several others followed behind her, no longer whispering, no longer uncertain. "You did it," Emily said softly. "No," Nathan replied. "Franklin did." Downstairs, the lobby had transformed. The customers who once laughed now stood awkwardly in clusters, unsure of their own complicity. A local journalist had arrived. Word was spreading fast. What happened today wouldn't stay inside Capitol First's walls. And then through the lobby doors, Franklin Miles stepped out. The sun had begun to set, casting gold over the snow-white columns of the bank. He walked slowly, carrying his old canvas bag over one shoulder. Each step was measured, not with age, but with memory. Employees moved aside for him. Even some of the customers instinctively created a path. One woman bowed her head. Another man whispered, "God bless him." Franklin paused in the center of the room one last time. He looked around, not for validation, not for applause, but to mark the moment, to etch it into memory. He turned to Emily and said, "Thank you, child, for believing in what no one else dared to." She smiled. "You're not invisible anymore, Mr. Miles." Then quietly, Franklin made his way to the exit. At the threshold, he paused and turned back to face the lobby. "I'm not here for revenge," he said, his voice clear as glass. "I'm here so that no one else has to be erased." And with that, he walked into the setting sun. Behind him, Nathan stood watching, ledger in hand, surrounded by a staff that had finally chosen truth over silence. Around them, a story that had been buried for 70 years was now out in the open, and the reckoning, it had only just begun. Life lesson from Franklin Miles' story. Franklin Miles' story reminds us that truth never truly dies. It only waits for the right moment to rise. In today's world, where injustice often hides behind polished walls and power structures, his quiet strength is a powerful example. He didn't demand revenge, he asked for recognition, and through his courage, he shook a system built on lies. So what can we learn? First, never underestimate your voice, even when you feel invisible. Like Franklin, your truth matters, even if the world tries to ignore it. Second, stand up when it's uncomfortable. People like Emily Carter could have stayed silent, but instead, they chose integrity over convenience. You can do the same in your own workplace, community, or circle of friends. Third, question the stories you've been told. Sometimes, what we accept as history or the way things are was built on injustice. Don't be afraid to dig deeper. Finally, know that change starts with one step. One person choosing truth can inspire many. It won't be easy, but it will be worth it. Let Franklin's journey be a reminder. You don't need a crowd to stand for justice, just courage and conviction.